serious about stopping people from living here illegally, contrary to our law, a nation based upon the rule of law, they need to adopt common-sense legislation that will stop this flow, not merely by reducing it by just 25%. I yield the floor and suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Now flies to San Diego. American now flies to Los Angeles, and we each have reduced slots. We each have reduced one slot each to places like Dallas or Chicago. I think that was good legislation. I believe that helps D.C. It didn't increase any flying to D.C. I don't think exemptions, by the way, just adding more flights, as you said, is a good idea. And we haven't. But
again, sir, what I'm saying though is that did have a negative effect on traffic through Dulles in terms of its ability, particularly in terms of international long haul, substituting that flight. And I thought that wasn't what I was keen on, but there was a logic of substituting major market inside the perimeter for outside the perimeter. I get that logic. My fear is that with this further concentration, the next step will be, the basic economic premise that helped build Dulles as one of the international gateway airports is going to be dramatically undermined if the deal that was made long before I served as senator is basically reneged on a going forward basis. And my hope would be that the position of the combined carriers, particularly if it was not forced to divest some of these slots because of this advocacy you've made for continuing to smaller markets, that we won't have the rug pulled out from under us.
Okay, fair enough.
I'd like to have your comments.
Well, anyway, thank you very much. And again, as we move to whenever that may be, the next FAA reauthorization or if this comes up again, we'd be happy to work with you to figure out ways, if they are possible, to allow more flights outside the perimeter without reducing service to small communities and without increasing flights to D.C. And if that has an impact on Dulles, we're happy to talk about what we might do. And maybe there is no solution to it. But those are our objectives: not to see flights from D.C. increased, not to see service from small communities decreased, but rather to have the ability, if possible, to serve more cities outside the
thing I just would, and I don't want Mr. Leoka to be able to comment as well before my time runs out. I just have to say very as strong a terms as I can.
Yes.
You'll have a very, you'll have a strong anti-force against this if a major calculus of this is not also the effects of these changes would have on the economic viability of the literally hundreds of millions of dollars that both the federal government and the Commonwealth of Virginia has made in the viability of Dulles.
Understood.
Senator Warner, your question is prescient in that if this merger goes through, Dulles Airport's going to take another hit. Because right now, I'm only an elite flyer on one airline. It happens to be Mr. Parker's. And that's because I always like flying him because he is the low-cost leader. But also, I can fly on his affiliates, on his alliances, going with United out of Dulles to go to Europe. And that will be eliminated. So that whole connection, all of U.S. Air's connecting flights to Europe are now going to no longer go through Dulles. They're going to go up to Philadelphia, to New York, to Charlotte, or down to Miami. So that's where we're going to find even more things happening. And what that leads me to another point where new destinations that he claims they have by uniting with American are only replacing old destinations where they already have an affiliation, which are already code-shared with United right now. So what they're giving with one hand, they're taking away with the other. So from a consumer's point of view, we end up with no net new routes. We just end up with new players and they're shuffling the deck. And that's where I look at not having good consumer benefits from this whole merger. And it won't help Dulles one bit if it goes through.
Thank you. Mr. Leoka, I wanted to continue because
your analysis of that there are U.S. Airways and American overlap on 12 nonstop routes, and for 7 of these cities there are no other nonstop competitors. So Department of Justice will have to look at these competitive overlaps and, understand this horizontal merger guideline. But you refer in your study 761 routes between domestic airports overlap between U.S. and American, and additionally 40% of routes face daily competition from U.S. Airways and 30% from U.S. Airways and American. Okay, so can you explain your study, and if you're saying that there is a better way to look at this issue on, potential merger impacts, market by market, or some of the things?
The way you have to look,
and Dr. Dillingham, I want you to comment on that as well.
Right. The way we need to look at it is the whole concept of a hub airline or a hub system is a system that connects. You fly into the hub, you fly out of the hub. That's the whole creation of it. And so if you look at a merger only looking at the number of nonstop direct, straight flights, and there's only 12 of them, that's not the good way to look at it. You have to look at how connecting flights compete. And that's what really works. If you're flying from Seattle to Austin, Texas, you will go Seattle to Dallas to Austin, or you go Seattle to Phoenix to Austin. But if you go into Kayak and you look it up on Expedia, you go to your travel agency, you're going to get a price. And those airlines compete like mad with each other right now. That competition is going to disappear. So what we did is we took all of the U.S. Air markets and we overlaid them with the American Airlines market, and we came up with 761 one-stop flights which overlapped. At that time, the GAO also did a similar study, and their study was released today, and it shows even a more dramatic overlapping. They come up with 1,600 something. And their study then is based upon more than one stop, maybe a two-stop connection and so on. That's how they ended up with more. So the way you look at how network airlines compete with each other is from destination to destination, not hub to hub, not nonstop routes. And so when you look at that, in our study, we came up with 40% of the current American airline routes are covered by U.S. Air routes, and 30% of the current American airline route or U.S. Air routes are covered by American airline routes because U.S. Air has a bigger domestic market. And that's the best way to look at it, and that shows real competition in the market, not necessarily only looking at the nonstop routes.
Okay.
Is that clear?
Yes, yes. Dr. Dillingham, what do you think about this approach that the Consumer Travel Alliance did?
We haven't actually analyzed, how he did his work or how the Consumer Travel Alliance did their work. But I would say, just to be clear on what the GAO did say, yes, we said there were 1,600, overlapping routes, but we also said that there was a competitor, another competitor on those routes as well. So I think, and I think the other point that we would make is that is our understanding that as DOJ and the FAA look through the merger, that they will have a comprehensive analysis more along the lines of not just nonstop, but also where there are overlapping routes. So I think, again, as we said before, a lot is yet to be determined, but clearly those kinds of issues will be addressed, that we believe, through DOJ and DOT.
Okay, I have another question, Mr. Leoka, about just ticket price transparency. I mean, there's nothing the consumer cares about more than this ticket price. And over the last few years, the fees and ancillary charges have grown dramatically from about $1.7 billion in 2002 to $9.1 billion in 2012. So shouldn't these ancillary fees be a little more in lockstep? And what do you think DOJ should look at that as far as the merger?
Well, I would like DOJ to look at that as part of the merger. However, I don't think that falls under their jurisdiction. I've talked with Department of Transportation. Department of Transportation currently has a rulemaking which is at OMB right now. And what we need, we've been trying to do, and I've spent even more time doing this than I have been looking at slots, we're trying to get the airlines to disclose their ancillary fees at the time that we buy our airline tickets. Right now, if we buy our airline tickets from a travel agency, and that will be from an Expedia or an Orbitz or from a corporate travel agency, we don't know how much the baggage is going to cost us. We don't know how much seat reservations are going to cost. And then there are a lot of other fees that go in there. But what I'm concerned with are the fees, baggage fees and seat reservation fees, so that consumers can compare prices. And especially if we end up with a merger coming through, which is wringing competition out of the system, there has to be a way that consumers can at least have an ability to comparison shop for tickets with everything together and look at oranges and oranges. And so that's what we've been trying to do. I think we're getting close to it. However, it's a long process to bring this thing through to fruition. And that's what consumers really need. Otherwise, we have no way to really compare the prices.
Ms. Curlin, is this under your jurisdiction, or is that someone else at DOT?
It's part of DOT. It's part of the General Counsel's office, but I can get back to you on that.
Okay. I know this is of great interest to lots of people and long time in coming. So, well, I think we've had an airing of the issues here. I think we've raised some important questions. We'll keep the record open for 2 weeks for the rest of our colleagues to ask questions, and if you'll respond to them. This is a very important issue, and I hope that the appropriate agencies take due notice of the issues that were raised here today and try to address them before this moves forward. But anyway, thank you all very much for being here. We're adjourned.
Thank you.
the senator may call for regular order with respect to that amendment.
I so move, Mr. President.
The amendment's now pending.
Pardon me? Okay,
The amendment is now pending.
it is pending? Okay. I move to table the Paul amendment. Ask for the yeas and nays.
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander, Ms. Ayotte, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Baucus, Mr. Begich, Mr. Bennett, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Boxer, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Chambliss, Mr. Chiesa, Mr. Coates, Mr. Coburn, Mr. Cochran, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons.
Motion table.
It's a table motion. Mr. Corker. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Cowan. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Donnelly. Yes, sir. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Flake. Mr. Franken. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mrs. Hagan. Mr. Harkin. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Heinrich. Ms. Heitkamp. Mr. Heller. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Isaacson. Mr. Johans. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota. Mr. Kane. Mr. King. Mr. Kirk. Ms. Klobuchar. Ms. Landrieu. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Mr. Levin. Mr. Manchin. Mr. McCain. Mrs. McCaskill. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Ms. Mikulski. Mr. Moran. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Nelson. Mr. Paul. Mr. Portman. Mr. Pryor. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island. Mr. Reed of Nevada.
I'm sorry.
Mr. Risch. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Rockefeller. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Scott. Mr. Sessions. Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Shelby. Ms. Stabenow. Mr. Tester. Mr. Thune. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Udall of Colorado. Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden. Senators voting in the affirmative: Coons and Reed of Nevada. Mr. Thune voted in the negative. Mr. McConnell. Mr. McConnell, no. Mr. Heller. Mr. Heller, no. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Grassley, no.
No, you have to stay on.
Mr. McCain. Mr. McCain, aye. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Schumer, aye. Mr. Cowan. Mr. Cowan, aye. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kane, aye. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Menendez, aye. Mr. Shelby. Mr. Shelby, no. Mrs. Fisher. Mrs. Fisher, no. Mr. Sessions. Mr. Sessions, no. Mr. Isaacson. Mr. Isaacson, no. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Sanders, aye. Mr. King. Mr. King, aye. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott, no. Mr. Alexander. Mr. Alexander, no. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bennett, aye. Mr. Johans. Mr. Johans, no. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Hoven, no. Mr. Carper. Mr. Carper, aye. Mr. Graham. Mr. Graham, aye. Mr. Donnelly, aye. Mrs. Murray. Mrs. Murray, aye. Mr. Coburn. Mr. Coburn, no. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Cardin, aye. Ms. Mikulski. Ms. Mikulski, aye. Mr. Levin. Mr. Levin, aye. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Crapo, no. Ms. Cantwell. Ms. Cantwell, aye. Mr. Casey. Mr. Casey, aye. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Cornyn, no. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Heinrich, aye. Ms. Heitkamp. Ms. Heitkamp, no. Mr. Burr. Mr. Burr, no. She got Mr. Paul. Mr. Paul, no. Ms. Heitkamp. Ms. Heitkamp. Aye. Mr. Coates. Mr. Coates. No. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Inhofe. No. Mr. Franken. Mr. Franken. Aye. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lee. No. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mrs. Gillibrand. Aye. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blumenthal. Aye. Mr. Begich. Mr. Begich. Aye. Mr. Tester. Mr. Tester. Aye. Mr. Cochran. Mr. Cochran. No. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Blunt. No. Mr. Sessions. I had you, yes. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wicker, no. Ms. Murkowski. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Wyden, aye. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Durbin, aye. No, not yet. Mr. Warner, aye. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Roberts, no. Mr. Nelson. Mr. Nelson, aye. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Cruz, no. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Toomey, no. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Rubio, aye. Ms. Landrieu. Ms. Landrieu, aye. Boxer. Mrs. Boxer, aye. Ms. Warren. Ms. Warren, aye. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Hatch, no. Mr. Reed. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, aye. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, aye. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy, aye. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schatz, aye. Mr. Udall. Mr. Udall of New Mexico, aye. Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown, aye. Mr. Enzi. Mr. Enzi, no. Mr. Moran. Mr. Moran, no. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Barrasso, no. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Bozeman, no. Ms. Hirono. Ms. Hirono, aye. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Merkley, aye. Ms. Baldwin. Ms. Baldwin, aye. Ms. Ayotte. Ms. Ayotte, no. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Whitehouse, aye. Ms. Klobuchar. Ms. Klobuchar, aye. Mr. Baucus. Mr. Baucus, aye. Mr. Pryor. Mr. Pryor, aye. Ms. Stabenow. Ms. Stabenow, aye. Ms. Collins. Ms. Collins, aye. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, no. Mr. Corker, aye. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Manchin, aye. Mr. Portman. Mr. Portman, no. Mrs. Shaheen. Mrs. Shaheen, aye. Mr. Vitter, no. Mr. Flake. Mr. Flake, aye. Yes. Mr. Udall of Colorado, aye. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Feinstein, aye. Mrs. Hagan. Mrs. Hagan, aye. Mr. Kirk. Mr. Kirk, no. Mr. Harkin. Mr. Harkin, aye. Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Chambliss, no. Mr. Rockefeller. Mr. Rockefeller, aye. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Leahy, aye.
Result will be the motion to table.
Okay. Any senators wishing to vote? The yeas are 61, the nays are 37. The motion to table is agreed to. The majority leader is recognized.
Mr. President, has this matter that just we voted on been tabled?
Senator's correct. Leader's correct.
Okay. Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that time until 4:25 tonight be equally divided between the two leaders or designees, with Senator Sessions controlling 7 minutes of the Republican time, and this be for debate on the following amendments: Manchin 1268, Lee 1208 as modified with the changes that are at the desk, Pryor 1298, Heller 1227, and Merkley 1237 as modified. We still have a number of other amendments that the managers are working on, and we're going to get to those later, try to at least. So, Mr. President, continuing my request, at 4:25 then, the Senate proceed to votes in relation to the amendments in the order listed, that the amendments be subject to a 60-vote affirmative vote threshold, that there be 2 minutes equally divided prior to each vote, and all after the first vote be 10 minutes in duration.
Reserving the right to object. Reserving the right to object, I'd like to ask the leader and the managers of the bill, both Senator Sessions and Senator Leahy, there are about 100 or so other amendments pending, and I know that we've been sort of held up the last couple of days, but there are amendments, and this is a question, that I have that don't really touch the heart of the bill, but that are important to connect to this bill that have no opposition that I know of. I'm asking the leader for amendments that have no opposition and have bipartisan support. When could we possibly get on amendments that don't have opposition?
Well, I say through the chair to my dear friend from Louisiana, the managers have been working through these amendments. And I know my friend says there's no opposition, but having said that, that doesn't mean there is an opposition. Yeah.
I should do more checking on them then.
But
Okay.
we have a number of people who are trying to get amendments on the list. We're going to continue to work on that. It's not because senators haven't tried, the managers. I would ask that my request be modified to have the vote start at 4:35 rather than 4:25. Otherwise, Senator Sessions won't have 2 minutes, let alone 7 minutes.
Is there objection to the leader's consent request? Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. President.
The majority leader.
I ask unanimous consent that a time be determined by me in consultation with Senator McConnell, the Senate proceed to executive session and consider calendar number 182. There will be 2 minutes for debate, equally divided in the usual form. Following the use or relating back to that time, the Senate proceed to vote with no intervening action or debate on the nomination. The motion reconsidered be considered made and laid on the table with no intervening action or debate, that no further motion be in order, and any related statements be printed in the record, and that President Obama be immediately notified of the Senate's action and the Senate then resume legislative session. In case anyone wants to know who this is, it's Michael Froman to be the trade representative.
Is there objection?
I expect to stack this after.
Hearing none, without objection, so ordered.
Mr. President, and unless Senator McConnell objects, we will have the vote right after this batch of votes, unless Senator McConnell has a problem with it.
Who yields time? The time will be equally charged to both sides.
Mr. President,
Senator from Alabama is recognized.
I would ask that the quorum call be dispensed with.
There is no quorum call.
Mr.
Senator
President,
recognized.
The Congressional Budget Office analysis of the Gang of 8 immigration bill confirms in dramatic fashion our most significant concerns about the bill. Indeed, I would say, at the history of the movement of this bill through the Senate, this is the most dramatic event yet. Basically, it says these things in explicit phrases after careful analysis. Number one, it will reduce the wages of American citizens. Number two, it will increase unemployment in America. Number three, it will reduce GDP per capita in America. The growth in our economy will be reduced by the passage of this bill. And it concludes that illegality will not be stopped, but will only be reduced by 25%. So we're talking about a bill that's supposed to be the toughest ever, that's going to promote economic growth in America, a bill that's supposed to make us economically stronger and be a bill that ends illegality in the future. And it just doesn't do that. As I've read the bill, I've studied the bill and looked at the bill, that's what I've been concluding and saying for weeks, each one of those things. And it's not, and the score confirms that. So I would ask colleagues, how can we vote for a bill that pulls down wages of Americans, that increases unemployment, and only has a modest reduction in the illegality that's occurring today, reduces GDP, and increases the debt? How can we do that? So the bill, for example, would increase welfare spending by $259 billion in the first 10 years and increase the on-budget deficits by 14. The on-budget deficits will increase by $14 billion. And it's been said, well, the overall deficit, when you account for the off-budget items, looks better. But that is a direct result of counting the Social Security, Medicare, FICA withholding on people's payrolls. That money for the people who are paying in is being set aside in trust funds and set aside to pay for their Social Security and retirement when they draw it in the future. You can't count that money as being improving the debt situation of the United States. And as soon as the prohibition, the 10 years or so, that limits welfare is off, then the cost of the legislation is going to go up much more. The bill would make no meaningful reduction in future illegal immigration. CBO estimates about 350,000 illegal immigrants would be added each year. As Senator Cornyn has said, it's about the difference in 7.5 million people would enter illegally in the next 10 years instead of the current level of about 10 million. So that's no 25% reduction. CBO writes, quote, other aspects of the bill would probably increase the number of unauthorized residents, in particular people overstaying their visas under the new programs for temporary workers. I've been pointing out that for weeks. People are going to come here with their families, supposedly to work temporarily for 3 years with the ability to extend for 3 years, and then who's going to be able to tell them to go home? They're not going to go home. In any realistic way, we're going to have a substantial increase in visa overstays. CBO concludes that's correct. It's a guaranteed policy that will not work. So the bill would result in a massive increase in the future legal flow of immigration. Current law estimates we will add 10 million people in 10 years, including the legalized illegal immigrants. That means 30 million immigrants by 2023. That's the number I've been using. I felt that was a fair, legitimate number. It's complicated. I asked Senator Schumer twice in the committee how many people will be admitted in the next 10 years and given legal status. He wouldn't say. The bill's sponsor won't tell us how many, but CBO now has said the figure I've used, 30 million, basically is correct. That's triple the number that would be admitted under the current legal flow of immigrants into our country. We admit 1 million a year. That would be 10 million over 10 years. and this would be 30. So we have to ask those questions. Finally, CBO tells us under this bill, quote, the average wage would be lower than under current law over the first 12 years, close quote. Let me read that again. Quote, the average wage would be lower than under current law over the first dozen years, close quote. Actually, they use the word first dozen years. So that should be the end of the bill right there. This is the chart that's in CBO's book, in their analysis, in the report. It's the exact same chart they prepared, not the chart I prepared. No, the presiding officer cares about this issue. This is the impact on average wages. And this is where we start today at the zero factor, and it drops down to 2024. 10 years of lower wages than if we didn't pass the bill, which only makes sense because we're flowing in a huge flow and supply of low-skilled workers, and they're going to pull down the wages, particularly of our lower-income workers. This is going to happen. Mathematics, free markets tell you that. So the country, the nation, the Congress should try to determine what the right flow of immigrant labor is and get it right so we're not hammering American workers today who are unemployed, who are struggling for jobs, trying to get better pay. And in fact, average workers' pay has declined since 1999. I thank the chair and would mention one more thing in the CBO's estimate of per capita GDP. This is their chart from their report, and it shows that through 2030, we have lower GDP per capita than if the bill never passed. I thank the chair. I'm going to yield the floor. Mr. President.
Senator from Alabama is recognized.
We have a few more minutes and no one else seeking the floor. I would just note that CBO's quote on unemployment rate, quote, S744 would cause the unemployment rate to increase slightly between 2014 and 2020. 6 years of higher unemployment rates. So we've heard a lot of talk over the years about the decline in wages, and I do think that's important for us to discuss. But how is that decline in wages that started over a decade ago has been accelerated with this legislation? How is it we're not talking about it? Senator Menendez, one of the intrepid authors of the immigration bill before us, made some remarks earlier this morning that I thought were pretty remarkable. He says not to worry about these first 10 years of lower growth, lower wages, and higher unemployment because, quote, the analysis actually gets better in the next 10 years. But if you look at that and how it plays out, what you would see is this. You would see that there is an improvement in the wages in the second 10 years, which, let me tell you, their projections are always better the first 10 years. But in the second 10 years, even if you saw some growth, the growth still does not get back to the level it would have been had the bill never been passed. We have to know that. The growth does not recover from the spot we already are. And respectfully, the inconvenient truth that he referred to is that this Rube Goldberg scheme that's been hatched will certainly help certain special economic interests and certain political interests will be served for sure, but it will be devastating for American workers at a time they're already hurting. I just don't see how we can justify that. Can you sustain? So we are supposed to tell the American people that they are to accept declining wages for another 10 years? How can that be the policy of the Congress of the United States? How can we tell the American people in a time when unemployment is way too high that we're going to pass a bill that makes unemployment higher? How can we tell them that the on-budget deficit is going to be increased? Am I hearing this correctly? To the public, I would ask, can you, American people, afford that? Can you sustain declining wages for another 10 years? Do you want your Congress to pass a law that will reduce your wages, that will increase unemployment? And what about after that? Well, because of the sustained downward pressure on wages, American wages 20 years from now will still be lower than they would have been had the legislation not passed. And particularly, as I indicated, it falls on the lower wage people today who are falling further behind, and the impact of the immigration legislation that's before us, the 1,000-page bill, experts tell us will fall heavily, more heavily, on the poorer people. So they will cause them to fall even further behind. The working people in this country are going to be hammered by this legislation. We need to be passing laws that help them get jobs, help them have higher wages, help them have higher and better benefits, and more full-time jobs, not fewer full-time jobs. So I don't see how we owe loyalty to Mr. Zuckerberg, who's Facebook billionaires running ads telling us what we're supposed to do. Does he know real people that are suffering out there today? Doesn't impress me. Claims he's some convention of conservatives running this ad. I'm not aware Mr. Zuckerberg is a conservative. Do we all owe our loyalty to him because he brilliantly produced Facebook? Or do we owe our loyalty to the working men and women who vote for us, who fight our wars, pay our taxes, and try to serve our country every year? Well, I suspect if Mr. Zuckerberg were to post job openings tonight on his Facebook, put out his salaries, what he wants to pay, he'd find there might be plenty of Americans who want to take these jobs. I suspect so. So I'd ask him to do so. Put on your website what kind of qualifications, what kind of salaries you'll pay. And let's see if we don't have more applications than you've suggested exist out there. We know we have college graduates in large numbers in STEM fields also having a hard time finding work. We know that's a fact. We've got senior engineers and scientists and computer people that would like to go to work too. Maybe they've been laid off. Maybe there's been downsizing, and they've got experience. Are they not to be considered? We've got to bring people in through some of these work programs for a period of time to take the jobs. Well, a good immigration plan can work. We may need to bring in some workers. We certainly need seasonal workers that we can bring into America if we do it right. And we need a guest worker program. I support that. And I support the 1 million people a year that are admitted into our country who work here every year. But this is a huge increase. The guest worker program will double under this legislation. So I'm afraid that we are not serving the legitimate interest of the American working men and women. Immigrant, native-born, black, Asian, white, Hispanic, that are here today, struggling today. Are we serving them if we bring in more people than the economy can absorb, that we can see will pull down their wages, make it harder for them to have a job? As the National Review wrote recently. And this is very wise, I think, and insightful. We are a nation with an economy, not an economy with a nation. And what that means is, to me, that we represent people, human beings, and we have an obligation to help them make their lives better and not to make their lives tougher. So it seems to me that we have such a pell-mell rush for amnesty that we haven't seen the enforcement. We've agreed to too much legal flow, and we have very little reduction in the illegal flow over the next 10 years. And for that reason, the bill should not become law. That's why the bill is in trouble. That's why we need to be listening to the House. They're having serious hearings, step by step, on this legislation. And the first legislation that I've seen that they've produced is really good. So we can reform the system. We can make it better. We can have a generous immigration system for America as we've already had. We can be compassionate to people who've been here for a long time and not try to deport everybody that's been here and done well but not illegally here. We can do something about that. But we need to be sure that the amount of workers coming are amount that can readily be absorbed, that can be assimilated, and we need to be sure that the illegality ends. And CBO says it will not under this bill. I thank the chair and will yield the floor.